Few stories in history capture the sheer audacity and eventual implosion of a nation like the tale of the British Empire. From its humble beginnings on a small island off the coast of mainland Europe, Britain built an empire that once governed over a quarter of the world's landmass and population. Known as the empire on which the sun never sets, Britain wielded unprecedented economic, political, and military influence from the 18th to the early 20th century. But success bred complacency, and ambition became a curse. Today, Britain finds itself grappling with the consequences of those imperial dreams, facing a downward spiral in global influence, a struggling economy, decaying infrastructure, and dwindling military prowess. The former titan of global hegemony is now often perceived as Europe's third world nation, a sobering reflection of how the weight of sustaining an empire can erode even the mightiest of powers. This essay delves into the geopolitical, economic, and social factors behind this transformation, highlighting astounding facts and fascinating stories that underscore Britain's fall from grace. The British Empire's expansion during the 18th and 19th centuries was driven by trade, colonization, and a fierce rivalry with other European powers. While it brought immense wealth and resources to Britain, the empire's maintenance demanded an unrelenting drain on its resources. Military overstretch. Maintaining control over vast colonies required a massive military presence. British forces were stationed in far-flung territories, from India to Africa to the Caribbean. By the late 19th century, Britain was spending up to 40% of its national budget on its military, a level of expenditure that would later cripple its economy. Colonial administration governing colonies wasn't just about force. It required bureaucracies, infrastructure, and personnel. Historians estimate that by the early 20th century, up to 60% of British government resources were tied to colonial administration, leaving domestic infrastructure underfunded and neglected. Resistance and revolts empire building also came with resistance. From the Indian Mutiny of 1857 to the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya during the 1950s, Britain faced constant challenges to its authority. Every rebellion demanded costly military campaigns, often with brutal reprisals. These uprisings were not just moral stains, but economic sinkholes, diverting attention and resources from Britain's domestic challenges. Astounding fact: India was often called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, contributing nearly £1 billion annually to Britain's economy during its peak. However, after independence in 1947, the loss of India marked a catastrophic blow to Britain's global standing, accelerating its decline. The two world wars in the 20th century were pivotal events that highlighted the fragility of the British Empire. The economic drain of World War I. Britain entered World War I as one of the wealthiest nations, but the war drained its economy to the brink. By 1918, the UK had amassed £8 billion in debt, much of it owed to the United States. Post-war reconstruction further strained its finances. Britain's industries, which were once the backbone of its economy, were repurposed for war production, leaving domestic infrastructure neglected. World War II, the final nail. The Second World War solidified the decline of Britain as a global superpower. The war cost Britain over $120 billion, leaving it dependent on American loans under the Lend-Lease Act and the Marshall Plan. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the dominant global powers, relegating Britain to a secondary role. Churchill's famous statement, "We are with Europe, but not of it," began to ring hollow. Astounding fact. By the end of World War II, Britain had to borrow soldiers from its colonies, including 2.5 million Indian troops, to sustain its war effort. The empire's dependency on colonial manpower highlighted its waning control. Decolonization was a complex, painful process for Britain. Between 1947 and the 1970s, most of its colonies gained independence, signaling the formal end of the empire. The economic fallout. The loss of colonies meant the loss of vital resources and markets. For example, Indian independence in 1947 deprived Britain of a primary source of raw materials and a significant consumer base for British goods. Many former colonies chose to diversify their trade relationships, often favoring the US or the Soviet Union, leaving Britain economically isolated. Immigration and domestic strain. Post-colonial migration reshaped Britain's demographics. While immigrants from former colonies contributed to rebuilding post-war Britain, They were often met with racism and social tension. These tensions strained Britain's social fabric, adding to the narrative of decline. Astounding fact, the 1956 Suez Crisis marked Britain's humiliation on the global stage. When Britain attempted to retake the Suez Canal from Egypt, it faced opposition from both the United States and the Soviet Union. The crisis exposed Britain's inability to act independently, effectively ending its status as a global superpower. The British economy, once the engine of the Industrial Revolution, entered a period of stagnation and decline in the 20th century. By the 1970s, Britain's industrial base was crumbling. Industries such as coal, steel, and textiles, which had once driven the economy, became uncompetitive in the face of global competition. Mismanagement, lack of innovation, and union strikes further exacerbated the decline. By the 1980s, unemployment in industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham soared to over 20%. The shift from industry to finance in the late 20th century deepened economic inequality. While London's financial district thrived, much of Britain's working class was left behind. This economic divide remains stark today, with Northern England often referred to as a forgotten region. Despite joining the European Economic Community in 1973, Britain's relationship with the EU was fraught with tension. The 2016 Brexit referendum symbolized Britain's isolationist tendencies, further damaging its economy. By 2023, Brexit had cost Britain over £100 billion in lost trade and investment opportunities. Britain's military, once the most formidable in the world, has seen its capabilities diminish drastically. By 2023, the British Army had shrunk to fewer than 76,000 troops, its smallest size since the Napoleonic Wars. Military spending, which once dominated the national budget, now ranks far below that of global powers like the US and China. Britain's involvement in conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan highlighted its reduced military capabilities. These wars, costing Britain over £50 billion, ended without clear victories, tarnishing its global reputation. Despite possessing nuclear weapons, Britain's Trident system is heavily dependent on American technology, underscoring its reliance on the US for defense. Britain's infrastructure, once a model for the world, now lags behind its European counterparts. Britain's NHS, once a source of national pride, faces chronic underfunding, long wait times, and staff shortages. Public transport, particularly in the north, is notoriously unreliable, with many areas lacking basic rail connectivity. The UK faces a severe housing shortage, with over 2 million people on waiting lists for social housing. Homelessness has surged, with many living in conditions reminiscent of the developing world. In 2023, over 2.5 million Britons relied on food banks, a staggering figure for a developed nation. The story of Britain's decline offers valuable lessons for other nations, particularly those aspiring to global dominance. Sustaining global ambitions without addressing domestic issues is a recipe for disaster. Over-reliance on a single sector, whether industry or finance, can lead to vulnerability. Failure to adapt to changing global dynamics can accelerate decline. Britain's journey from a global superpower to its current struggles is a cautionary tale of hubris and overreach. Once the envy of the world, Britain is now grappling with its diminished role, trying to find its place in a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. While its past achievements are undeniable, its present challenges serve as a stark reminder that no empire, no matter how mighty, is immune to the forces of history.